Hi, thanks so much for having me. My name's Orla, as you said, and I'm a fourth year PhD student in the Department of Applied Psychology here in the University of College Cork, Ireland. And yeah, I was lucky enough to get my piece published a couple of months ago. And I guess I'll talk a little bit more about that process later on. But my paper was titled Role for Insight, Understanding How the Experience of Playing D&D Impacts the Mental Health of an Average Player. So yeah, just to start off, this is me, and my background started off in early years and childhood studies, and then I did my master's in women's studies and decided then to move over into psychology. So my main research interests are fantasy gaming, role-playing games, autism, like anything social skills related, and participatory design as well. So my PhD is around D&D and using D&D for autistic people, and like I guess it's all participatory work in that there's a lot of co-design in it and stuff like that. Um, Interestingly, this paper specifically came before my PhD, so I guess like a lot of people I saw in the chat, my interest in D&D started around lockdown time. It came about a year before that, but I guess we started playing a lot more during lockdown because, you know, no one could say they were busy. So we got to play all the time. Um, and I guess why I started studying D&D in the first place. So previously, my research was kind of around asexuality, and I was looking at, I guess I was really interested in gender and sexuality. And I'd always been a really big board game player. You can probably see behind me, there's like loads of board games. And I was working in a board game cafe at the time, just before lockdown. And I had never played D&D before, but people would come in and play D&D. Most of my coworkers played D&D. Um, and I guess I was a little bit nervous about playing for the first time because the people that I worked with that played they just seemed really good at it. They did like these amazing accents and they tell me about their amazing characters and all the things they did. And I didn't know if I'd be like creative enough for it or if I'd, be able to come up with a character that was really interesting. Um, but they convinced me to start playing, and I think initially personally, I fell in love with the character creation like many people do. Um, and I just found that I was expressing different parts of myself that maybe I didn't know were there, or parts of myself that were harder to express in like your day-to-day life. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And I guess I started playing at a time that was kind of like a transitional time in my life, and there was a lot of change going on, and D&D was a kind of a thing that was just there every week, and it became like this reliable um just this reliable thing in my life. So when it came to my master's, we had to conduct a research study, and it was like the perfect timing. So I decided to start studying D&D, and my research has been in the same space since, which is amazing, and I feel very like fortunate for that. So I suppose before I go into my findings, just a brief background on RPGs. I know everyone here is probably, well versed in D&D, but just in terms of some of the literature that's there, that RPGs exist at the intersection of four different phenomena: roles, play, game, and media. And it is this interaction that makes them unique. At their core, RPGs build off a fundamental form of make-believe, social identity, and reality, which give the games a form of structure. And I think it's this make believe and almost, when I started playing, it was kind of the first time that I had had that sort of fun since I was a child. And there was something really just nice about that. And I think a lot of people feel the same way, where you kind of get to get in touch with your inner child, or you get to like explore like you did then. I think like as an adult, sometimes you're not really encouraged to have fun. Um, so one significant influence on role playing in therapy comes from psychodrama. So that was developed in the 20s. And we can very much see role play still being used today in that kind of space. So in CBT, it's very common for role play to be used. Um, Related to my own research regarding autism, role play is very often used as well to practice skills or just practice different scenarios. But in my opinion anyway, that type of role play is very boring, because you're just pretending, you're being yourself, and you're just acting out a, scenario. And there's nothing fun about that. And I feel like when there's fun, we learn so much more. Um, so with D&D, we have that element of, yes, it's role playing, and yes, we can do a bunch of different things, but it's also fun. So I suppose a poignant piece of work was in the 80s, and it was by Fine. It was an ethnography about how people navigated different perspectives or frames during gameplay. And Fine found that players operated within three different perspectives. So the player as a person, gaming mechanics, and perspective of the character. So I'm sure you all know there's been many reported benefits of playing RPGs. So conflict resolution, communication skills, perspective taking, developing literacy, math skills, just overall well-being, so all these different things. But I guess when I started researching this, and that this would have been in 2019 when I started, yeah, I think 2019 when I started researching it, there was very little about D&D specifically. Now there's definitely more now, and I guess I tabled the paper for a couple of years, and when I came back to it, I was really pleasantly surprised that there was quite a bit more research on D&D now. But at the time, there was so little. It was all about like role-playing games that were made specifically as serious games or stuff like that. So again, I was really curious whether all of these things were transferable to D&D. And I suppose it's important as well to establish that there is very much a difference between running a game with the hopes that it will be therapeutic, and with the hopes, that it will benefit people, and running the game with an explicit therapeutic goal. And there's lots of different groups that have explicit therapeutic goals. And again, when I started researching this, this was primarily in the US, and these same groups were popping up for me all of the time. But I've discovered, especially since my paper was published and different people have kind of reached out to chat to me, there's a lot more of this than I thought there was, which is amazing, because this is what I'm really, really interested in, is D&D with like an explicit goal. Um, and I guess as well, just to mention the impact of COVID, even though I'm sure no one likes talking about it anymore, is just that the sales of D&D tripled during that time. Um, and even just anecdotally, I found that a lot of people, who had been curious about playing, finally took the leap during that time and said, okay, I have all this time now, we can play online. And I was skeptical about playing online at first, because I started playing in person. I just thought there was no way that playing online could capture that same excitement, or it could be as fun. But I actually really like playing online. Um, I'm such a homebody that it's just really nice, and I think the tools are really great for it too. Um, and in my title of my paper, there is the word mental health, and the way that we are defining mental health in the study is a state, well, it's by the World Health Organization's definition. So a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn and work well, and contribute to their community. So it's not focusing on like diagnosable mental health issues, it's more overall well-being of players. So in terms of participants, so I did 10 interviews. The interviews were about, on average, an hour and a quarter. And I only had like 8 questions, but I'm sure everyone can relate to when you start talking about it, it's kind of hard to stop talking about it. And I found that participants were really excited to just tell me loads of different anecdotes from their last campaign or tell me about a character or something really poignant that happened in game. So that was really fun. And I just had such a great time doing the interviews. I really wanted to continue, but because it was a master's project, obviously there was a limitation on how much time I had. And then we went into lockdown and it was a whole thing. But I guess in psychology and in qualitative research, 10 interviews is still a pretty normal amount to see in a paper. Um, so I had 6 men, 2 women, and 2 non-binary people. The ages were like early 20s to mid 50s, and then from the US, the UK, and Ireland. And I was happy that I had that kind of, some different places. And initially I was quite worried because when I put out my first post, I was only contacted by men. And I had to like specifically put out a post looking for a different perspective. But I was pretty happy in the end with how the recruitment went. In terms of my analysis, I use a thematic analysis. So a thematic analysis is very common in qualitative research, and it's basically just a tool for recognizing patterns amongst data. TA is really accessible and it's actually one of the first. So I teach research methods now in the university, and it's one of the first methods that we teach students. But it really is such a nice and flexible method of analysis. And before I list out my themes, I have this quote here from one of the participants. Obviously, it's all pseudonyms that I'm using. And I just thought this quote was so lovely and really summed up what people were communicating with me in general. So he says, I mean, yeah, I could go from B to B and get a little bit of honey, but I could also go straight to the hive and get a whole load of honey in one go, right? So yeah, I thought this was a really nice quote because I guess when the paper was published, it got a bit of media attention online, and with media attention comes some negativity. And I was having people saying like, oh, isn't it so obvious that playing a game is good for you, and like kind of questioning like, why did you even do the research? And I guess firstly I'm like, well, if we don't do research, we don't we don't know things for sure. But also it was this element of D&D that like people were getting so much from it under so many different categories. So it was like, yeah, they were able to um be creative and socialize and have escapism, but it was all with the same thing. Um, so my themes, I had escapism, exploration of self, creative expression, and then a sub-theme of that was providing for others, social support and safe space, and routine. So escapism might be maybe an obvious one, but it was a really strong theme. Um, so primarily this was on the positive impact that this had. So as Nat says, there's nothing more amazing than being able to do the things that you didn't think you could do. Jason says, I get to sit back and relax and forget about any worries that are ongoing and that exist outside of the room. So this very much aligns with past research that escapism can be positive as getting away from any stressors in our lives. This quote here, I think, is really powerful. And this is from Jason as well. As well as my own, other people would come to me with their problems. I would be a pillar of support for a lot of my friends. It allows me to, because when you're living in your own head 24 hours, 7 days a week, it's a lot. But if you get away from that for even 4 or 5 of those, it's a big relief. It's a big breath you can take. D&D has been a glowing hand that pulled me out of a dark place. And I just think that imagery is so amazing. Um, Jason talked a lot about how he's kind of, you know, the funny one out of his friends and the one that's always able to cheer people up. And then he never asks anyone for help. And that he, I guess, seeked that support through D&D and through his characters and through DMing rather than in his everyday life. People wanted to forget about work and having no money and all of those different things that I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. Um, but I suppose when we talk about escapism, it's also important to mention that it can be negative as well. Sometimes when we step back from our problems, when we're faced with them again, they might seem bigger. And I guess it is important when talking about escapism to mention that there can be an avoidance related function with it. But to be honest, I didn't really see this in the interviews that I did. People did talk about being maybe like stressed after playing or something like that when they started thinking about their problems or what was going on. But in general, it was a positive experience regarding escapism. So the second theme, exploration of self, is definitely the most interesting for me anyway, and I think it's the most unique to D&D itself. And this is people exploring their identity through the game or navigating their problems through the game. One of our players, Nat, had just started working a new job, and in her new space, it was primarily men, and she was finding it quite difficult to, I guess, um, speak up for herself. So she started playing a character in game that was really confident and that would say what she wanted to say. And as she says here, it started to really show that you can do that. And this experience for her became a transformative experience because not only was she playing a confident character and getting the experience of playing a confident character or acting confidently, she also became more confident in herself in her everyday life. So this phenomenon where a player's emotions and thoughts kind of move between in-game and out of game is called bleed. And here, Nat is using her confident nature in the game to impact her life outside of the game. And she ended up being able to stand up for herself in some stuff that was happening in work and share her opinion more. And so this type of bleed is bleed out because the character is impacting her in her everyday life. And she talked a lot about just feeling more capable, and it was really like talking to her was so amazing because it the game had really just done so much for her. Um Again, as we mentioned a minute ago, Jason, he talked about, I guess, being that pillar of support for his friends and family. And he experienced the loss of a grandparent. And as he says, if I'm feeling particularly down any day or week, I might bring in a dark, deep monster who might represent an emotion I went through that week. This year, I lost my grandfather and I was feeling quite down about it. And for a while, I brought a dark entity into the campaign who annoyed and patronized and hurt the characters, but they were able to fight back. And even watching them do that was like a release for me. So, Jason, this experience is about DMing, and he really used that role of a DM and I suppose the possibilities that there are when you're DMing to help him navigate grief and loss. Which again I think is such an amazing thing that he was able to do through D&D. He is, well, engaging in something called steering. So he is steering towards a bleed in effect. So kind of the opposite of what Nat was doing. And being able to do that is very much, I suppose, unique to the role of the DM because they have that, extra power in guiding the story. And this also is related to shadow work. where he's processing his grief through game. So I suppose the thing that came up a lot when talking to players about this experience and about this is that everyone playing understands what you're saying and what you're doing as actions of your character. You know, when I do something as Gloria, my current character, no one looks at me and says, "Oh, Orla said that," or "Orla did that." So there's a buffer there. No one is assuming that you are, saying anything that's related to what's going on in your own life or anything like that. So it allows people that space to express feelings where, maybe you don't want to say that outside of game. Um, but again, just to touch off the potential negative sides, we did, or I did talk to a couple of people who had negative experiences with other players, whether that was people bringing really difficult topics into the game, without, going through it with other players first, or players, I suppose, dealing with emotions in game that were tricky for other players. Um, and I guess any kind of space like this can have negative consequences. So it's important for us to, do things like the session zero or having one-to-one chats, or if you're DMing, ask people if there's any topics that are really sensitive for them, anything that they don't want to bring up. And there's also the X card, which you can just present on the table, and then we kind of move on swiftly from whatever topic we're talking about. So creative expression is the next theme. And I suppose players really enjoyed the character creation. I suppose character creation was one of the things that people talked about a lot, but we know that creativity is very tied in to mental health. And Chris describes the massive impact of D&D on his mental health. In previous years, the player had been on a downward path and pinpoints the creative freedom in D&D as the major catalyst for change in his mental health. So this links to research on creativity, being a motivator in playing RPGs and fulfilling psychological needs. And a sub-theme of creativity was providing for others. So anyone who DM'd or had DM'd talked about how exciting it was to watch people discover their stories or evoke emotions in people, make people laugh, see them struggle with their decisions. Um, and I thought this was a really interesting facet of creativity. And again, it was more of, I suppose it's more unique to D&D in that um, it is a little bit different from ways that we might think are like typically creative. So social support then was something that came up massively, and people found that it was just this connection to a core group of people. And it was interesting talking to, you know, adults about making new friends, because it's definitely something that can be difficult as an adult, is finding new friends or a new group of people. And I suppose people typically mentioned how when you're playing D&D, all of a sudden you're, doing an accent, or you're talking about like outlandish things, or you're describing something really funny, or solving a problem together. And that's not typically, I guess, how we interact with people when we first meet them. So it very much breaks down a barrier. Like my D&D group are probably my closest friends now, because I feel like we've experienced so much together. We have so many like crazy stories that we have, and yeah, I guess it really did break down that initial barrier. People described their like party as friends for life. Um, Emily talks about moving to a new city, and she found that D&D helped her with her depression and anxiety. Cameron in his 40s struggled with loneliness as a parent, but D&D's intense moments built strong friendships that offered much needed social support. And we know that social support is linked to very strongly to our mental health, but obviously that we live longer and healthier lives if we have strong social support. So a sub theme of this was safe space. And I thought this was, I suppose, a really lovely sub theme that came up. One of our players, Ash, made a character that was non-binary, and in the game talked about, being non-binary and what that meant for the character. And then afterwards told the rest of their party that that was actually very real for them. And they were able to explore, I guess, what might happen if they came out in a space where, if it didn't go how they wanted, they could just say, okay, that was just my character. So there's a link here to something called alibi, as a player is resolving something for themselves in game. So it allowed them to create this safe distance from, this is what I'm saying and this is very real for me, and then what their character is saying. And lastly, routine. I was kind of surprised that this came up in the sense that I didn't think it would be that important to people, but most of our players mentioned that just having that constant thing was super important for them. People might play every Wednesday night and it's just built into your week. Derek explains it's built into something that I can expect. On a boring day, it's a highlight. On a stressful day, it's kind of a respite. It doesn't matter if I'm having the worst week, there's a D&D campaign at the end of it. So looking forward to things is very powerful for our mental health. For Emily, she was struggling with her depression and anxiety when she moved to a new city, and just knowing that she had that in her routine was a massive benefit to her mental health. And past research very much shows that too. And I'll skip on a tiny bit because I'm looking at the time, but I guess bringing it back to um, this initial quote, I think is really, I just love this quote. I just think it's so great. Um, so just in conclusion, looking at whether these different elements are connected to D&D or whether they could be connected to any hobby. And I guess in research, we have to think about these things and, okay, are our findings actually coming from the game itself? And I found that the the escapism that D&D offered was unlike other hobbies that were linked to escapism, things that are maybe more isolating. The exploration of self in D&D was, I think it's probably totally unique in exploring identity and, different things that are going on in your life. Creative expression, and in particular, being able to create worlds and then actually enter those worlds and explore those worlds. Um, Social support, yes, it can be linked to lots of different things, but the collaborative storytelling was so powerful and it was something that people really benefited from. And then routine, of course, is common to many different hobbies, but I guess the combination of all these different things in D&D is what makes it a unique and immersive experience. And just in terms of final notes, that if the game is run therapeutically, which I think it absolutely can be and should be, it should be, I suppose, as a in a holistic approach, in that it isn't the only form of support that a person has. Obviously, the results of the study has been limited to the context that it was carried out in. When asking people if they wanted to be interviewed about D&D, I guess we can assume that they probably had a positive experience, that they are really passionate about it and want to speak about it, and also that the data was analyzed through a neurodivergent lens. And yeah, so currently in my research, where I am is my ethics has just gone in for my study 3 of my PhD, and that is co-designing a D&D campaign with autistic people that will look at like specific goals that we set out in our last study. And yeah, in my research participatory design. So including the people that we're researching is really important to me, and so is fun. So that's obviously why I decided to study D&D, and D, and that's everything.